or will do some thinking about how this might affect the way Christians understand the doctrine of creation. And maybe readings of the Genesis texts.
Thank you. So this is a question about the fact that Moltmann uses eschatology really throughout his writing, the idea that this isn't an appendix, something that happens at the end, but it's something that infuses all of Christian theology, and therefore what are the implications for perhaps some of the stuff that almost happens earlier in terms of our thoughts. What about doctrines of creation and so on? I think this is again an area where I'd want to be speaking alongside some of the theologians who are working out of disability, because there are all kinds of notions about should intersex and should disability and other kinds of, I suppose, variant embodiment, should they be figured as something which has gone wrong, or should they be figured as something which has been created and has been meant to be that way in its own right? And I don't think it's always as either or as that. I think there's kind of people saying that there's a tension there as well. One of the interesting things is that in a lot of the kind of conservative Christian theology, which has talked about intersex at all, it just often comes back to this Genesis stuff. God created male and female in God's image, and so it's obvious that that's the way we're supposed to be. Now, there are some theologians who've explicitly, from the perspective of trans and intersex, who've said, okay, male and female are made in God's image. What that means is that sex is good, that difference is good, but what it's not saying is that only those particular types of sex or sex difference are good. So I think, I feel like I'm really early on in this thinking here, but there's definitely questions to do with, from the beginning, what do we figure as good? And when we read in Genesis, God created humans male and female, I think we often don't do the thinking of saying, is what the biblical writers mean by male and female the same as what we mean now? Because scientifically it certainly isn't. They're working within a very different scientific paradigm than we're now working in. And therefore, kind of theologically, yes, there's a continuation there of sorts, but there's a real discontinuity as well. And that's going to be to do with actually what we say that means. Because I guess it comes down to indicatives and imperatives. You can say things are a certain way, or you can say we think things should be a certain way, and therefore we're going to make things be that way if they're not that way somehow. What some people want to appeal to is notions that actually it's sex differentiation itself, which is somehow a function of the fall or is a secondary stage, and that actually perhaps androgyny is a more primal stage, and this comes up in some rabbinic literature, for example. That's not a very good answer, I'm afraid. But it's an area that I'd like to think about some more. So, question here.
I'm wondering, because you presented at the beginning issues in human sexuality, or at least some issues in human sexuality, and how when intersex people are brought up, it's usually in relation to transsexual people, and one of them is seen as like legitimate, and the other is seen as not legitimate. And then you kind of contrasted that attitude, because they were saying, well, that there's like an obvious kind of logical problem that they're like, well, in this instance it's not acceptable, and in this instance physical surgery is. But I'm wondering whether perhaps that those ideas and some issues in human sexuality and up at the top levels are particularly the reason why there is more acceptance, or there is some acceptance of intersex people at this kind of like local level, since it's seen as at least somewhat legitimate in some instances. So it's a lot easier to say, especially in a religious instance, don't do something, rather than it is compulsory that you do something else. So do you think that might have something to do with why there's seems to be, at least from what you see or what you've heard, more widespread?
Yeah, so this is a question to do with, I mentioned some issues in human sexuality, which is it's actually the Church of England's reflection on its 1991 statement on sexuality, but they've got a chapter in there on transgender. And the question is saying, kind of despite how problematic that text is, actually, could this be part of the reason why intersex seems to be understood relatively non-pathologically, certainly among the people who I've interviewed and in their congregations? That's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought about that association. I mean, certainly among the people that I spoke to, number one, they themselves didn't necessarily seem particularly aware of what the teaching actually was higher up in their denomination. So it's difficult when you're doing research, but I sometimes wanted to push a bit and say, so you as a Roman Catholic don't perceive any mismatch between what your priest is saying to you and what's going on higher up. And I wanted to say, do you actually know what the Roman Catholic Church says about it? You know, I didn't, but I kind of would have liked to in some ways. So I think on the one hand, I'd want to say no, because I'm not sure how many people who are kind of outside of academic theology or who are not clergy people, I'm not sure how many people engage with those documents. Okay, so that would be one part of the answer. But on the other hand, I guess there's a broad question about actually, if these things get spoken about at all, isn't that better than them not being spoken about at all? And even if they're spoken about kind of imperfectly, does that at least open the discussion? And I think, yeah, there's probably something in that. And I think one of the reasons why some clergy, for example, seem willing to talk about this and willing to engage with it is because they've perhaps begun to hear something about intersex. But I think I'd still want to come back to saying, actually, I think lots of the things that have been criticised about the treatment of transgender in some issues, like the fact that no transgender people were consulted or talked to in that process, there's other problems. I'd want to say I think that speaks to something more problematic and something fuller about the way those documents are sometimes put together. But yeah, that's something for me to think about more about whether actually that could be part of what's contributed to this relatively open attitude in congregations. So thanks for the question. Yeah.
I work with Jewish ritual, and in Jewish ritual, like particularly conversion and burial procedures, you cannot undergo those rituals unless you are male or female. So there's a movement within the Jewish trans and intersex community to say, how shall we be buried? How shall we enter the tradition? And to make a movement to figure out ways to come in and to go out. And I wonder, in the Christian tradition, is how do people who do not fall cleanly into one category or another encounter ritual where gender is a prerequisite?
Yeah, thank you. When I was in Boston last week, actually, somebody asked, not coming from the Jewish side actually, but asked a similar question about ritual and whether anyone that I'd interviewed kind of talked about particular rites of passage or particular types of liturgy they found helpful, and they didn't, but I didn't specifically ask them about that, and maybe if I had they would have done, I think it's really interesting actually. I've been thinking a little bit about kind of Jewish responses to intersex recently, because I was thinking about some of the reasons why in Christianity the maleness of Jesus is given such importance, and I think that happens for lots of reasons, but I think one of the reasons is this conception that Jesus is a second Adam in some way, that he's also a high priest in some way, that he's a sacrificial animal in some way, and that all of these things kind of have maleness attached to them. So I was doing some reading around, what the Jewish responses to intersex, both historically and now, are, and I'm sure you know lots more about this than I do, but what I seemed to come across in that reading was an idea that certainly historically and in the rabbinic texts, yes, you had to be male or female, but they seemed to understand two different ways that you could be intersex. So you could be androgynos, which is like our word androgynous, and that's where there's some kind of visible ambiguity where your genitals don't look male or female, but there's also this word tumtum, and this seems to refer to someone whose genitals are kind of covered up or concealed in some way, and the idea that if you could get through this, you could kind of find out what they are. And what I was really interested in was that in the discussions I was reading, they were saying, well, historically, the way that you determined sex was just to do with genital appearance, but now, they didn't say we know better, but they were certainly saying now we have different information to work with. We can do chromosomal analysis and so on, and should we now? Or should we still say it's basically to do with what your genitals look like? And the people that I was reading who were most of them were rabbis, were saying, well, actually within Judaism, if you can circumcise something, then do it. And if you can make someone male, then do, because if you make them male, they can participate in all kinds of mitzvahs and all kinds of rituals that females would not have access to. And I found that really fascinating, because actually within the kind of medical literature more broadly, what's been much more common is to assign intersex children as girls, because the surgical techniques to kind of make male genitals aren't very good, basically. It's very difficult to make a penis that can be erect and can ejaculate and so on. Whereas, you know, often the understanding has been, well, a vagina doesn't really need to do anything, it just needs to be a hole, basically. And I was really interested by the fact that on the Jewish side, you know, but I was thinking, I think this comes down to a privilege of maleness from both sides. So, from the Jewish side, perhaps, it's saying it's better to be able to participate in male rituals if you can, so assign people male if there's any doubt. But from the other side, it's saying there's something about male genitalia which kind of have to be potent and active and have to do things, and kind of females don't, they're much more passive. So I was thinking about this. I mean, I'm not sure that Christian rites of passage tend to be gendered in the same way. So, I mean, one that would spring to mind would be something that doesn't tend to happen anymore, which would be the churching of women after childbirth, which certainly in the Church of England, and I don't know about the Episcopalian Church, has kind of got subsumed with the thanksgiving for the birth of a child. There's no longer this sense that the woman herself kind of requires a ritual purification from that birth. So I don't know, I wonder whether that's a difference, but I also wonder, just because Christians don't have perhaps so many explicitly gendered rites of passage, you know, perhaps it's actually more honest when you do have explicitly gendered rites of passage, and you can say, well, this is why this person's problematic, because we don't know where they fit. We don't know whether they have to, you know, we don't know what they have to do or not do. But yeah, that would be another thing that I would want to think about more, and perhaps we can be in touch about that. That would be helpful to me. Thank you.
Susannah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for